It was Alex's first hunting trip, and as the car rumbled over the winding, cracked road into the heart of Wyoming's remote forest, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. His friend Greg, the trip organizer, had been inviting him on this adventure for years, and he'd always said no. Greg was a seasoned hunter who could rattle off the names of every animal species they'd come across, while Alex could barely distinguish a deer from an elk. But this time, he'd finally given in, lured by the promise of a weekend of bonding, fresh air, and the chance to unplug from the stress of everyday life. They weren't alone. Alex sat crammed in the back seat with Paul, his college roommate, and Michael, Greg's cousin, while Michael's girlfriend, Emily, sat up front beside Greg. They laughed and talked during the drive, but as the road narrowed, so did their voices, and an eerie quiet settled over them. The forest loomed around them like an ancient fortress, the trees so tall and dense they blocked out the sunlight, casting deep shadows that seemed to stretch out to grab at the car. Alex shivered involuntarily, his stomach twisting into a knot. After what felt like an eternity, Greg pulled into a small, deserted parking lot. They unloaded their gear, hoisting heavy backpacks onto their shoulders and grabbing their rifles. Alex's was basic, a loaner from Greg who had insisted he bring it just in case. He had no real desire to hunt, but he figured carrying a gun might help him blend in with the group. As they hiked deeper into the forest, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were merely an observer of his own actions. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves conspicuously absent, replaced only by the distant, unsettling creak of branches swaying in the wind. They trekked nearly a mile in before they found a small clearing nestled between a cluster of towering pines. The mist hung low, curling around their ankles like tendrils of some unseen force, giving the forest an almost supernatural quality. The group set up camp, and Greg, as usual, took the lead, barking out instructions about how to properly secure the tents and sharing tips on hunting tactics. Alex tried to pay attention, but he found himself distracted, his eyes drifting to the trees where shadows seemed to flicker and shift just beyond the edge of his vision. As they finished setting up camp, a movement caught Alex's eye. He turned and froze. Emerging from the mist, three men stood on the edge of the clearing, watching them. They were tall, with tangled hair that hung in greasy mats over their pale, weathered faces. Their clothes were filthy and worn, barely more than rags, and their eyes, sunken and expressionless, held a strange, unsettling intensity. The men made no sound, just stood there, their bodies almost blending into the trees like specters that had been born from the forest itself. "Evening, fellas," Greg called out, his voice loud and confident. But Alex could hear a hint of strain beneath his casual tone. He could feel the tension rippling through the group as they each turned to face the newcomers. The men remained silent, their eyes unblinking, as if they were assessing each one of them. After what felt like an eternity, one of them lifted a hand in a slow, deliberate wave, and then, without a word, they turned and melted back into the mist, vanishing as quickly as they'd appeared. "Just some locals, probably out here doing the same thing we are," Greg muttered. But his voice had lost its bravado. Alex met Paul's gaze, and he could see his own fear mirrored there. No one spoke for a moment, the uneasy silence settling over them like a shroud. Finally, they went back to their tasks, though Alex noticed that their laughter was now muted, their movements tense and guarded. The group spent the afternoon wandering through the forest, with Greg leading them in search of elk. They found none, but Greg did manage to shoot a deer, which he dragged back to the camp with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. Alex watched with a mixture of fascination and revulsion as Greg gutted and cleaned the animal, his hands slick with blood, his face set with grim determination. They roasted the venison over a fire, the smoky aroma filling the air. But Alex could barely eat. Every bite tasted like ashes, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see those three men standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them with their hollow, empty eyes. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness thick and suffocating. They gathered around the fire, telling stories to pass the time, but their laughter felt forced, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them jump. Alex could feel a growing sense of dread gnawing at him, an instinctive, primal fear that told him they were not alone. Eventually, they retreated to their tents, one by one, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. Alex lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling of his tent, listening to the rhythmic breathing of Paul beside him. He tried to calm himself, telling himself that it was all in his head, that he was overreacting. But sleep eluded him, and he found himself straining to hear any sound, any hint of movement outside. Then he heard it. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, circling the camp. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. As the footsteps grew closer, they stopped just outside his tent, and he could hear the faint, rasping sound of breathing, as if someone were standing just inches away, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. The zipper began to slide down, agonizingly slow, and Alex felt his blood turn to ice. He shut his eyes, feigning sleep, willing himself to remain still as the zipper stopped and a shadow fell over him. The intruder lingered for a moment, and Alex could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on him like a weight. Then, just as slowly, the zipper slid back up, and the footsteps moved away. He lay there trembling until he could no longer hear the footsteps, and then, with a surge of desperation, he unzipped the tent and crawled out into the darkness. He crept over to Michael and Emily's tent, intending to wake them and tell them what he'd seen. But as he approached, he noticed their tent flap was already open. He leaned in, peering through the dim light, and what he saw made his stomach lurch. Two of the men were crouched over Emily, their faces twisted into sickening grins, their hands pressing down on her as she lay limp and unmoving. One of them held a syringe, the needle gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and he was pressing it into her arm with slow, deliberate care. The sight filled Alex with a visceral horror, and he let out a strangled cry, his voice breaking as he called for help. In an instant, the camp erupted into chaos. Greg and Paul scrambled out of their tent, rifles in hand, and the men turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to fury. They moved with an eerie, unnatural speed, disappearing into the darkness as Greg fired a shot, the gun's sharp crack shattering the silence. But even as the men vanished, more shadows began to emerge from the trees. Dozens of them, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. They surrounded the camp, moving in slow, deliberate circles, their bodies swaying in a grotesque, rhythmic dance. Alex could feel the air grow heavy with their presence, as if the forest itself had come alive, closing in around them. He grabbed Michael and Emily, helping them to their feet, and together they stumbled through the undergrowth, their breaths ragged and panicked. The shadows followed them, flickering through the trees like wraiths, their laughter echoing in the darkness, a twisted mocking sound that seemed to seep into Alex's bones. They ran until their legs gave out, and then they crawled, the forest pressing in around them, the shadows looming closer with each passing second. They could feel the eyes on them, watching, waiting, as if savoring their fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shadows melted away, and they found themselves standing on the edge of the parking lot, gasping for breath, their bodies battered and broken. They piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, and Greg floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they tore down the dirt road. They drove in silence, the forest fading into the distance, but the shadows remained, lingering at the edge of their vision, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lay hidden within the heart of the wilderness. None of them spoke as they reached town, their faces pale and drawn, their minds haunted by the memories of that night. They tried to forget, to push the images from their minds, but the shadows remained, lurking in the corners of their vision, a constant, suffocating presence that whispered of the horrors they had left behind. And in the quiet moments when they closed their eyes and let their guard down, they could still hear the footsteps circling their camp, waiting for the moment when they would return.